So, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that one of my favorite kind of decks are mid-range decks, specifically not in the Commander format. I'm a Pioneer and Modern player, and I also am trying to get into Standard with Sultai mid-range, because Gliss is a fun card, and Sultai seems to be a color combination with all of my favorite cards in it. However, there is a slight problem with enjoying these kind of decks. I mostly get to play Commander, which means I don't get a chance to play these kind of decks all that often. Most of my decks end up having to be some kind of big synergy pile that does something in order to compete with the people around me. And while there is a lot of fun in that, I found from playing my Sauron deck that playing a deck that has zero cohesion, zero synergy, and just, well, operates as a pile of good stuff is sometimes way more fun than playing a deck with a lot of intricate pieces that go together to form some kind of game plan. I think some of this might be a carryover from my time in Yu-Gi-Oh!, where as the format started to move further and further into archetypes and hyper synergies, I started to enjoy the game less and less. I really enjoyed the game when most of our decks were literally just piles of good stuff, and your only three ofs were things like, well, in this case, Apprentice Magician, which, if you don't play Yu-Gi-Oh!, you have no idea what this is, and we've now lost the plot. Suffice it to say, back in 2006, Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks, and to a degree even a lot of Magic decks, were basically these piles, where you had Breaker the Magical Warrior. It blows up spells and traps. DD Warrior Lady, she blows up creatures. Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, he can blow up graveyards. Magician of Faith, she can get cards out of your graveyard and put them into your hand. And that's really all the deck is whatever the best cards in the format were that did those particular jobs, all in a single deck. And there's a lot of people who don't like this style of game because it feels very, very bare bones and basic. To me, though, it just feels like playing a really nice game of chess. Sidebar, if you've never played GOAT format for Yu-Gi-Oh!, I highly recommend playing GOAT format. However, all of that brings me to today's commander, which is Feelix 5 Boots, a commander who I've historically really not liked because I do not like doubling effects in Magic the Gathering. I think that they're some of the most boring win more strategies you can possibly use. But I really like combat in Magic the Gathering. I like just turning creatures sideways at my opponents and letting them try to figure out the math on their own. So why not go ahead and make a deck that is effectively just a mid-range deck with a bunch of creatures whose only job is to turn sideways at our opponent. Not for any critical mass of any one effect, not for any particular ability, just good cards that hit our opponents and end the game eventually. Can we make a deck like that for $15? Feelix 5 Boots is a Sultai and 2 5/4 Menace Ward Ooze Rogue Commander. And if any of your creatures deal combat damage to an opponent, if that causes a triggered ability of any permanent you control to trigger, then that ability will trigger once more. Now, like I said, Feelix is one of those commanders that I just did not like because I do not like commanders that just double up on a thing, despite really wanting to like them with previous iterations of cards like Ishin. Now, I say this, but this is exactly what happened to me with Sauron. I did not like 8-mana Sauron. I couldn't stand the idea of an 8-mana commander that basically did the effect of a 1-mana reanimate spell, and, well, that was it. But now that I've actually had time to play him, he's one of my favorite decks. So I'm going to start trying to build some more of these less synergistic, more cohesive decks. And if that idea sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you've seen some content from Salubrious Snail, who's a much better Magic the Gathering theorist than I am, but the gist of their video, which you should definitely watch, called The Strange Method for Building EDH Decks That I Can't Stop Using, is that most Commander players have this habit of taking a commander that does a thing and then building a deck around the thing the commander does. Whereas instead, you could build a deck around, say, a counterweight commander, a commander that is built to offset the downsides of something that your deck does, or a commander that enhances it in some other way as opposed to being a linchpin of some combo or anything like that. So While Feelix 5 Boots is 110% a synergy commander, as he does double up on combat synergies, if we make it so that the 99 of our deck do not contain any cards that greatly benefit from this, but do benefit from it in a small way, we can actually live out that mid-range strategy game plan of an aggro deck that has a lot of control pieces. This way, our aggro cards that are small in mana value will be able to get ever increasingly good versions of their effects that are scaled for only happening once, that we will start abusing a little bit. And hell, you could even add double strike into this deck and you would abuse these effects even more, but we're not doing that today because we're not trying to lean that heavily into it. So to facilitate this game plan, let's go ahead and throw a bunch of creatures who have nothing to do with one another in, pure tote format fashion, who just happen to be good at the effects that they have. And, well, two of these cards have to do with one another, and they are Kezer, Ruthless Stalker, and Ukima, Stalking Shadow. I've included these because they have the partner mechanic, and I like both of their effects individually, so I figured putting them together would be a good idea. Ukima says whenever it leaves the battlefield, it deals X damage to a player and you gain X life, where X is its power, and it cannot be blocked. And it partners with Kezer Ruthless Stalker, which says whenever any creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may put a 1/1 counter on that creature. And because we are not trying to create a giant synergy pile, we will not be adding to this 1/1 counters theme with cards like Hardened Scales and Branching Evolution. Instead, we will be adding more individual cards that do the 1/1 counters thing, and do the 1/1 counters thing very well. Let's go ahead and talk about Experimental Lab and Staff Room. We're not really going to be using the Experimental Lab side of this that often, but the Staff Room side of this says whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, then we can put that creature face up or put a 1/1 counter on it. This is just an extra edition of Kezer's effect that we'll have access to, and we'll add even more of these effects with cards like Necropolis Regent, which say whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, we'll put that many 1/1 counters on it as well. These are effects that work very well on their own, but in a world where our creatures are dealing damage to our opponents and our commander is doubling these effects, a card like Necropolis Regent hits you for 6 and ends up with 18 power at the end, which, again, is not going to be the main goal. Ideally, this deck should work just as well with Feelix as it will work without Feelix. But there's another 1/1 counters mechanic that I think we should add in, and that is a pre-combat mechanic. Draina, Liberator of Malakir, has first strike and says whenever she deals combat damage to a player, we put a 1/1 counter on every attacking creature we control. This means in a world where we have Draina and Necropolis Regent, Draina will hit, and if our commander's out, we'll get 2 1/1 counters on all of our other creatures. And then Necropolis Regent will see that, and then add that many more 1/1 counters onto all of our other creatures. Now, there's even another 1/1 counters strategy that I don't see used enough, and maybe it's because it's a parasitic mechanic from a set that only received one mechanic that was really noteworthy, but it's the backup mechanic. Archpriest of Shadows is one of the best backup cards to showcase this, as it has backup 1, which means when we play this card, we will put a 1/1 counter on a creature, and then until the end of the turn, it will gain whatever effects Archpriest of Shadow had. So it will gain Death Touch, and whenever the creature deals combat damage to a player or a battle, we'll return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield. It's a reanimation effect built in combat, with 1/1 counters being its main synergy, and if our commander's out, we'll double up on that. But again, we don't really need the commander. Let's also add in some more backup pieces like Doomscar Warrior, which gives the same backup effect of adding a 1/1 counter to something, and then also says whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player or battle, look at that many cards on the top of our library, reveal any creature or land from them, and put it into our hand, giving us access to some fun draw, basically. We'll also add in the Conclave Sledge Captain, which has backup 1, and backup 1, meaning it will throw its ability on multiple other creatures, and give the same ability of whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put that many 1/1 counters on it, just like Necropolis Regent. And since it gives trample on the creatures that it's throwing it onto, we can throw that trample onto, say, our commander to make our commander quite huge if we really wanted to. But the Sledge Captain is a great card in its own right. It does the combat thing very well, and it will make all of our creatures incredibly big on its its own. Next, let's add in some creatures that give us some benefits for hitting our opponent that do not rely on our own deck, like Schema Thief, which will let us clone any artifact from our opponent's board onto our board if it touches somebody's face, and Thief of Sanity, which when it deals combat damage to a player, we get to look at the top 3 cards of their library, put one of those cards face down, and put the rest into their graveyard, getting rid of potentially tutored pieces, and also just giving us whatever their best cards are. And then we have Feywild Visitor, which says whenever one or more of our creatures deal combat damage to a player, we will make a single 1/1 blue fairy. But with our commander out, it will be 6 1/1 blue fairies because it is per player, and Feywild Visitor only works when our commander is on the board. So we will always get 2 to 6 fairies with this whenever we have it out. We're also going to be running a Koma the World Eater as a top end, since with Trample in Ward 2 or Ward 4, it can stick around on a board dealing damage for a long time. It can't be countered, and if it deals combat damage to a player, we make 4 3/3 blue serpent creature coils. Or 8 with our commander out. Koma's a beast in his own right, and I've made a Koma deck already to show how nasty this card can get. Let's make it even more nasty in a deck that can double up on its ability if our commander isn't dealt with. And with all these combat triggers, I asked myself, if I'm building a deck based off just a good pile of things I really like, what's a mechanic I really, really like with some cards that I don't generally get to use in all of my decks? And of course, if you've seen this channel for a while, you know that that mechanic is going to be the initiative. I am a dungeon fiend, and I adore the initiative mechanic. The way the initiative works is when you gain the initiative, you will go into the secret entrance, searching your library for a basic land card and putting it into your hand. That's already pretty good. Every upkeep afterwards, as long as you maintain having the initiative, you will go further and further into the Undercity, and you can only follow the arrows for the initiative. So in a normal game, let's say we go into the secret entrance, then we'll add 2 1/1 counters to one of our creatures. Then we'll accelerate the game by making one player burn for 5. Then we'll draw a card going into the archives, and then finally on the 5th upkeep, we'll go into the Throne of the Dead 3, which will allow us to play a creature from the top 10 cards of our deck and give it 2 1/1 counters. There are a couple of tricks to note, though, and that is that the initiative works like the Monarch, which is an ability I wanted to add into this deck as well, but there weren't that many good ones at the price I was looking at, so we just skipped on that. But with the initiative, if you have the initiative, another player can take it from you by dealing damage to your face. This accelerates games because it forces players to start engaging in combat more, which is the kind of game that I want to have more of in Commander anyway, so this worked out. The other thing is when you finish the initiative, when you finish the dungeon for the initiative, there are several creatures that have benefits for that with initiative. Your opponents can get all of the benefits of the initiative, but you alone will get these initiative synergies. So let's go ahead and look at what some of those are. The Ravenloft Adventurer gives us the initiative when she touches the battlefield. If any creature an opponent control would die, we exile the card instead, Hiltering Reanimation Strategies. And whenever she attacks, if we have completed a dungeon, a defending player will lose 1 life for every card they own in exile with a hit counter on it. This means even if Ravenloft Adventurer dies at any point, it still will see all the hit counters from previous instances of the Ravenloft Adventurer. The Tomb of Horrors Adventurer allows you to copy your spells, but you'll copy those spells twice if you have finished a dungeon, and of course, it gets you the initiative when it touches the board. When Risorel Kingpin enters the battlefield, we'll take the initiative like everything else, but she has a huge benefit for us having the initiative. Whenever we attack, target attacking creature gains Death Touch until end of turn, but if we have finished a dungeon, that creature will also gain 5/0 and First Strike and Menace, making it far harder to block the creature and giving us a huge boost to its damage. Then we have Erakoa Sneak, which has no benefit for the initiative, but is an evasive creature, and From the Catacombs, another way to reanimate creatures from our graveyard, and it'll give us the initiative when we do. We can also play From the Catacombs any number of times by exiling 5 other cards from our graveyard. I originally wanted to add a lot of ways to refresh our graveyard, since our deck will end up drawing lots of cards, thanks to effects like the initiative and some of the stuff we'll talk about later, but this is the card that caused me to not do that, because I would rather use all those cards as fuel to keep casting From the Catacombs over and over again, going further and further into the dungeon, and getting more and more of our important creatures back. Next, let's talk about some creatures who only have one job, and that is to be evasive duders. But I've made care to make sure that every one of these evasive duders has a secondary function. Most of the time, that function is just having Death Touch, which is ridiculously important in a combat deck. Let me paint a scenario for you. Your opponent swings a giant beater at you, like the Dragon, and it's gonna kill you, and you have no choice but to deal with that. But if you have a winged Codal in your hand, you flash it out immediately, it blocks the Dragon, and suddenly the Dragon is dead, and you're probably safe, and probably not going to die. And if you have an opponent with lots of big, beefy creatures on the board, having cards like Winged Codal and Needlethorn Drake on your board makes it very hard to swing at you, because with Flying and Death Touch, you can cover most bases of Magic the Gathering. Most things that would be problematic for you can just be circumvented by having these blockers. If you end up in an aggro race with somebody, some of the flying Death Touchers like Vampire Nighthawk and Nighthawk Scavenger have the added benefit of strapping lifelink onto themselves. And the Nighthawk Scavenger can generally gain you 8 life a turn if there's enough permanents in your opponent's graveyards. Then Baleful Strix replaces itself as a cantrip while also having Flying and Death Touch, and the Hornet Queen, which is in every precon known to man for some reason, but it's not a legendary, so I can't make a deck about it. Hornet Queen gives you 4 1/1 green insects with Flying and Death Touch, meaning you have 4 creatures to trigger your combat stuff, and also 4 creatures to block problematic other creatures, not counting the 2/2 Flying Death Touch Hornet Queen herself. Finally, since we are a combat deck, we need ways to guarantee that combat will kill our opponents, so we have 2 overrun style effects in the deck. Though, without tokens, these will be weaker than they would be in other decks, but I've made sure that both of the options that we've chose have a greater effect on top of just being an overrun effect to make up for that short sight. In the event that you are using Storm the Citadel, the added bonus is that whenever one of your creatures deals combat damage to a player, you'll blow up an artifact or an enchantment they control. This means even if you can't win the game, you can cripple people's entire mana bases by ripping all of their mana rocks away from them, as well as important pieces like Omniscience and Bolas the Citadel off of their boards. The 2/2 to all of your creatures is gravy on top of that. Then End-Raze Forerunners gives 2/2 Vigilance and Trample to all of your creatures, which is good enough on its own, but the added benefit is that it is a 7/7 Vigilance Trample Haste creature in its own right, meaning after you spend 8 mana to drop it on the board, it will still kick around, hurting your opponents and giving you extra combat trigger steps. So, no matter how you slice it, these cards are going to do a lot of work for us, irrespective of the game they find themselves in. Anyway, that's the core strategy for this Feelix 5 Boots deck. A pile of good stuff that can do combat things, and that's really about it. But we need to talk about draw engines, because we need to be able to dig through a deck, because our deck has so many non-synergistic pieces, there's no real way to layer them such that we'll gain massive advantage over our opponents. So, let's go ahead and talk about our draw engine. We are going to be running a 10-card draw package, and some of these are looters, some of these are straight draw effects, and some of these have added benefits that we need to talk about. Let's talk about the looters first. Looter Ilkor has Shadow, so it's very hard to block it, and whenever it deals combat damage to opponent, we draw a card and discard a card. Shadowmage Infiltrator does the same thing, but it has Fear, and we don't discard a card. Suspicious Stowaway does make us discard a card, and it can't be blocked, but it has the added benefit of having Day and Night, so it can turn into the Seafaring Werewolf, where it still can't be blocked, gets a little bigger, and no longer makes us discard a card. Wharf Infiltrator has Skulk, and when we discard creature cards, we can turn them into Eldrazi's if we need. Otherwise, it's basically another Looter Ilkor. For the creatures that do not make us discard anymore, though, Cold Eye Selkie has Island Walk, so most people are not going to be able to block it if they have blue, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we draw that many cards, meaning any of our 1/1 counter synergies now suddenly can draw us 2, 3, or even 5 cards. Jolriel Voice of Zhalfir turns our lands into green-blue birds, where they have the same power as cards in our hand, meaning if we have a 7-card hand, we will be dealing 7 damage a turn with Jolriel and drawing a new card anytime a land creature deals combat damage to a player. Past that, we'll be running Coastal Piracy, Reconnaissance Mission, and Bident of Thassa. Each of these gives our creatures the ability to draw a card whenever they deal combat damage to a player, with no muss, no fuss, and no other issues. But I would recommend only put one of these on the board at a time, otherwise you will just die to your own decking out. Then we have Kaito Dancing Shadow, a card that I run in my Pioneer Dimir deck, and I absolutely adore. If you use its +0 ability, you draw a card. If you use its +1 ability, a certain creature cannot attack or block, useful for stopping a flyer from doing anything neat until your next turn. However, its bread and butter is that whenever one or more of your creatures deal combat damage to a player, we may return one of them to our hand. And if we do, we may activate the loyalty abilities of Kaito twice this turn rather than once, meaning Kaito can draw us 2 cards a turn or stun 2 creatures a turn. Kaito notably lacks an ult, but can create 2/2 colorless drones with Death Touch, which already make them hard to block, and if those drones ever leave the battlefield, each opponent will burn for 2, and we will gain 2. This means every turn, we could potentially stun a creature and make a drone until Kaito goes down to 1, and then start using these stun and draw card effects to build him back up, giving us 2 to 3 drones, which can punish our opponents for wiping our board. 6 damage may not seem like a lot of a punishment, but if we're chipping them down every turn, eventually 6 damage, 8 damage, 10 damage, these numbers start stacking up to something that's way harder to negotiate about when trying to calculate board wipes. And that does it for the deck's draw engine, but since we are going to be running a mid-range style deck, we will need to run a heavy removal package. So let's talk about that package. To allow us to engage in the mid-range game plan, we are going to be running 14 removal and interaction pieces, trying to lean on creatures where we can, and counter spells where we can, and cards that have high modality where we can. First of all, let's go ahead and get it out of the way. We are running the basic cancel spell. While I would like better counter spells in this slot, unfortunately for the budget we're going for, sacrifices have to be made somewhere. Where we are not making sacrifices, however, is in the counter spells of Sinister Sabotage and Refute. Each of these cards give us deck knowledge and allow us to sculpt our draws, but Refute allows us a loot ability, whereas Sinister Sabotage allows us a surveil ability. I currently use Sinister Sabotage and Refute in Pioneer, so this is a welcome home for both of these cards. However, past that, we have Negate, which is a commander staple, allowing us to get rid of any non-creature spell on the stack, and another commander staple counterspell, Wash Away, which for 3 mana operates exactly like Cancel, but for 1 mana counters any spell that wasn't cast from its owner's hand. While you may initially think this is great for stopping things like Cascade, the real reason we're going to be using this is because 1 mana to counter a commander is way bigger than you may think. Stopping an opponent from playing their commander 2 turns early for 1 mana is both hard to predict and hard to recover from for a lot of decks that are reliant on their commander to function. So that's why we have cards like Wash Away. As for modal removal, Raven Form lets us get rid of artifacts or creatures, Binding the Old God allows us to get rid of any non-land permanent and ramps us, Feed the Swarm gets rid of enchantments and creatures, Return to Nature gets rid of artifacts, enchantments, or cards in graveyards, Putrefy gets rid of artifacts or creatures, Trigon Predator gets rid of an artifact or enchantment every time it deals combat damage to a player, which you know what that means with our deck. Acidic Slime has Death Touch, so he can get in there and is hard to block, while also being able to blow up any non-land permanent effectively. He can, or any non-creature permanent, artifact, enchantment, land. He just can't kill planeswalkers or battles, but we don't see those that often, and we are such a combat-centric deck, we're just going to punch the planeswalkers in their throats. Then we have Resculpt, which gets rid of artifacts and creatures for the low cost of giving our opponent a blue and red elemental token, which they can't even block with our deck. And then we have Rankle, Master of Pranks, with flying, haste, and some combat tricks that allow us to harm our opponents greatly, making each opponent sacrifice a creature, lose a life and draw a card, or discard a card. With the amount of draw power in this deck, we can use Rankle to get rid of entire hand states at once and not really care that we've done so. If we've got a Coastal Piracy out, we'll draw 2 cards anytime Rankle hits an opponent with our commander out. And since we're doing that, we'll automatically make our opponents discard 2 cards with Rankle's effect, as long as our commander's out. That means we'll always have a net 0 of cards in our hand, and our opponents will be drained by a collective 6 per turn cycle. eventually that starts to stack up to hurting a lot, and there's a reason Rankle was an all-star in Standard for as long as he was. Finally, I want to talk about board wipes, and we are a go-wide deck, so we are going to be running only 2, but I want to make sure that the board wipes we are choosing are ones that leave us with a board state and not our opponents. So, Necromantic Selection, since it blows up everything and then lets us reanimate a creature from the graveyard. Sometimes we can use that to just snipe our opponent's commanders away from them. And then Deathbringer Regent, which comes onto the battlefield blowing up everything but itself, leaving us with an evasive 5/6 dragon, which is fantastic in its own right. All in all, this leaves us with a 16-card removal package that should be able to stun our opponents from doing anything important. And remember, we've got plenty of draw to see those cards, and cards like Thief of Sanity and Schema Thief to take our opponent's cards, so if they've got any important pieces, we will use those as well. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the next set of cards that are very, very important, the ramp spells, and of course our mana in general. For ramp, we can go a little conservative with a 10-card ramp package, since we don't need a whole lot for a deck that really kind of tops out at 5 mana for most of its cards. Let's talk about the first ones, though. Heaped Harvest, which lets us get 1 land out of the deck when we play it, and 1 land out of the deck when we sack it like a food. Dawn Treader, Elk, Wayfarer's Bauble, and Font of Fertility are all the same card. They come onto the battlefield, cost 3 mana over the course of 2 turns, and get any land out of our deck onto the battlefield tapped, as long as it's a basic land. We're also going to be running Rampant Growth and Search for Tomorrow and Cultivate to get basic lands out of our deck. We also want to make certain, and I need to emphasize this very hard, please, if you have Search for Tomorrow in your opening hand, don't forget you can suspend it and get the land out in 2 turns. I see people not like this card sometimes because it's not as good as Rampant Growth and costs 1 more, but unlike Rampant Growth, the land from Search for Tomorrow comes into play untapped. So it's the exact same rate of return as Rampant Growth, and it can come down a turn earlier by paying 1 mana into the suspend cost. All in all, I actually like Search for Tomorrow more than I like Rampant Growth in most decks on its own. But we also have the Mana Rocks Arcane Signet and Honored Heirloom. Arcane Signet's a basic include, but Honored Heirloom allows us access to removing things from our opponent's graveyards at will. Finally, we're going to run 1 Explore the Underdark, which is here both as a way to get 2 lands out of the deck, but also as a way to give us the initiative. So we have 6 cards total that have the initiative stapled onto them. Past that, due to budgetary constraints, we are running a heaping helping of basic lands to try to push through. Our deck leans heaviest into blue, so we're running 8 islands, 7 forests, and 6 swamps, with our 10 dual lands being, I don't want to admit it, but yeah, temples, they're in here. I don't like temples all that much, especially in a 3-colored deck, but we are running on a budget, and we need to make sacrifices somewhere. So we are running a Temple of Mystery, Temple of Defeat, and a Temple of Malady as some of the only tap lands in the deck. Past that, we're running the Tainted Isle and Tainted Wood, so that as long as we have a swamp, we have access to all of the mana our deck needs. A Sunken Hollow, as it is searchable as you start upgrading the deck, and it comes into play untapped as long as we have 2 basic lands. Then we will have the filter lands of Viridescent Bog, Overflowing Basin, and Dark Water Catacombs. Each of these is a fantastic card that gets way too much flack for being as good as they are. Finally, we'll run a single copy of River of Tears because for 10 cents, it's very hard to argue with an island that can sometimes swamp. Past that, we're going to run the fetching lands of Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, Foreboding Landscape, and Myriad Landscape. I would be running more of the Shire Terrace Promising Vein style cards, but our deck is so low to the ground that our turn 2s very rarely can be spent using those cards, so we're going to nix them from this build in lieu of running the temples. Then we have the Omni lands of Exotic Orchard and Command Tower with a single utility land being Pit of Offerings, allowing us to get rid of cards in graveyards if we need, giving our deck lots and lots of ways of stopping graveyards, stopping hands, and getting rid of cards on the field. All in all, this means our deck should be able to get to its colors very quickly, has tons of utility, and, well, in an ideal world, we should be able to provide a lethal game state to people by turn 8, or at least a game state that is threatening that, because, well, if we've controlled their boards, then it doesn't matter if our game state's lethal. We only need a lethal game state if our opponents have one first. So, let's talk about how to play the deck, though it should be fairly simple, it's just mid-range. Now, one of the benefits to having a deck that is based entirely on cohesion, like Snail said, versus a deck based on synergies is we actually can be very free with the stuff in our opening hands. They just need to be piles of good stuff after all, and our deck is built from piles of good stuff. However, with this opening hand, we actually have a really strong start. We've got the Search for Tomorrow as ramp, and we've got 2 creatures that can do combat stuff to our opponents. So let's go ahead and start on turn 1, playing a forest and tapping it to suspend the Search for Tomorrow. We'll move into turn 2, playing an island and tapping 1, 2 to go ahead and get that Needlethorn Drake out there, and we will move into turn 3, where the Search for Tomorrow will go into our deck and go ahead and grab a swamp. Now, the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and play a Dark Water Catacombs to give us access to all of our deck's colors in multi-amounts. This means when we tap 1, 2, 3, we'll be able to get Draina, Liberator of Malakir on the board. We'll keep Needlethorn Drake up as a blocker. We don't need it to do anything major just yet. We'll move into turn 4, and we can go ahead and play a forest out now. Now we've got a couple of options. We can sculpt our next turn by putting Risa Reed Kingpin on the battlefield, but as we haven't completed a dungeon yet, we don't really need to do this. We could play Feelix 5 Boots right now, but all we would get out of it is an extra 1/1 counter on the Needlethorn Drake. I think the correct thing to do would be to set up our following turns by putting Explore the Underdark out there. This will give us the initiative, getting a basic land out of our deck. It'll also rip 2 other basic lands out of our deck, allowing us to have better draws going forward. And since the initiative is out, we will get more advantage as the game goes on. So we'll grab a swamp and an island from the deck, and we will go ahead and put a counter on the initiative, allowing us to get 1 more island out of the deck. Now, if we swing with Draina and the Needlethorn Drake, we will go ahead and get to put a 1/1 counter on the Needlethorn Drake, dealing 3 damage to an opponent, or 4 damage to an opponent, and starting things out for us. Now we can move on to turn 5, and we've drawn Endray's Forerunners. We don't have the board to use the Endray's Forerunners, and let's assume we don't have the initiative anymore. Somebody's likely hit us, so we don't have the initiative. So what we're going to do instead is we are going to play an island and overcommit just ever so slightly. We'll put the Shadow Mage Infiltrator out so we can draw cards on a following turn, and we're going to go ahead and pay 5 and get Feelix on the board. Now, whenever Draina punches an opponent, we'll be able to do a couple things. We'll be able to go into the Forge, putting 2 1/1 counters on a creature. Let's go ahead and throw them onto the Needlethorn Drake. Then, Draina hits the opponent, putting 2 1/1 counters on each of our attacking creatures. Now, our Needlethorn Drake is a 6/6 and is dealing 6 damage when it touches the opponent. And nobody's going to block it because nobody's blocking a Flying Death Toucher with 6 power and 6 toughness. Now when we move into turn 6, let's again assume our opponents have taken the initiative away from us, so we can't use our initiative stuff yet. We'll play Temple of Deceit in order to see our top card. It's a reconnaissance mission. I'd like to keep that, so we'll keep it exactly where it is. We're going to hold on to this Sinister Sabotage in our hand in order to make certain that we can block any problematic cards going forward. So we're going to pay 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and put Risa Kingpin on the board. Well, we're not going to do that just yet. That would be a mistake. If we put her on the board, we'll gain the initiative, which is great, but then we would be losing a combat trigger for the initiative. Instead, we're going to go ahead and enter combat and have Draina, Liberator of Malakir, attack with the Needlethorn Drake and the Shadow Mage Infiltrator. The Infiltrator will draw us a card when it deals damage to an opponent, but first, our Draina needs to add 2 counters to itself, 2 counters to the Drake, and 2 counters to the Infiltrator. Draina hits first for 5, and then makes itself a 7/8. The Infiltrator and the Needlethorn Drake now hit for 11, and let us go further into the dungeon, draining a player by 5 life, meaning we've potentially chunked a player for almost half of their life total on this turn alone. Now that we've done this, we can move into main phase 2 and pay 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and put Risa Reed Kingpin on the board. This will allow us to draw a card by going further into the initiative, and we get to hold up a Refute and a Sinister Sabotage in case our opponents try to board wipe us. Let's assume that we have to do that. We're going to go ahead and use the Refute so we can draw a card and discard a card. We don't really need, let's say, we don't really need Ukina right now, but it would be able to put Kaiser into our hand from our library, which we could use way more. So let's say we get rid of the Endray's Forerunners, as we don't have a big enough board to use it anyway. This means we go into turn 7, and if we've countered a spell, we can assume our opponents probably haven't swung into our Death Touch Risa Reed. If that is the case, then we get to go ahead and finish the Undercity, looking at the top 10 cards of our deck and putting a creature from the top 10 cards of our deck onto the battlefield. I think the Tomb of Horrors Adventurer is the best one, but we're going to dig all 10 cards deep. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9... 10. Yeah, it's going to be the Tomb of Horrors Adventurer. This means the second spell we cast during the turn is going to be copied twice. And right now, let's go ahead and say that our second spell is going to be Reconnaissance Mission. You know, for funsies. Let's make it a big turn. So we're going to pay 1, 2, 3, and put Ukima on the battlefield. Well, actually, does he strip Legendary from the cards? No, he does not strip Legendary from the cards. So we will pull Ukima out on the battlefield. That'll put Khazar Ruthless Stalker into our hand. We'll go ahead and play a Forest, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cards in our hand. Instead of putting Khazar on the battlefield, let's go ahead and threaten our opponents with just biggest dickus energy, where we go ahead and play our second spell, which is going to be 2 copies of Reconnaissance Mission. Now, when we swing our creatures into an opponent, we will get a few triggers. Obviously, Risa is going to add 5/0 to one of these creatures. Let's say the Shadow Mage Infiltrator. Then we're going to add the 2 counters to each of our creatures. This means our board is a 10/10 Needlethorn Drake, a 9/10 Draina, and a 10/7 Shadow Mage Infiltrator. This should kill our opponents on their own, but since 9 triggers of Reconnaissance Mission are going on the stack, let's go ahead and draw 9 cards. Now we've got a hand of 11 cards, and if our opponents tried to do any kind of fog shenanigans, we would just Sinister Sabotage the fog and stop it from happening. Now we've got a giant hand. We do not care if we get hit with any kind of board wipes, and Ukima's out. It doesn't matter. We don't need Ukima. We need the other half of Ukima, Khazar, and we were able to tutor that out of the deck with Ukima. This is turn 7. The goal was to be able to threaten some kind of interesting board by turn 8. We've done it a turn early and probably eliminated a player out of the game entirely with nothing but good stuff combat shit. That's all. This deck is everything I've wanted it to be and more. But really, where would you go from here? The deck's already doing exactly what I want it to do, but if we had some more money to throw into it, could we make something a little more efficient? Well, let's find out. So I was able to find some cards that I think you could use to give this deck some lateral upgrades, but I don't think they would actually affect the power level of the deck too terribly much. It's already doing what it wants to do, and doing it very efficiently at that. But if you were to try to upgrade the deck a little bit, I might consider cards like Shoreline, Looter, in place of things like Looter Ilkor, maybe. It has the Looter Ilkor ability, but if you hit Threshold, then it will just keep the card in your hand without the need to discard. Stolen Identity can be used to copy cards on your board, and because the Cipher ability gives you the ability to copy this spell anytime that you deal combat damage to a player with the encoded creature, then you can do all kinds of nutty things with this. Maybe one of the Vampire Nighthawks could be swapped out for a Henrika Dominathi, which of course allows you the ability to sacrifice creatures from your opponent's boards, draw cards, or transform her into the Flying Death Touch lifelink mommy that she is right here. Cards like Beast Within and Assassin's Trophy can obviously be used to get rid of more problematic cards on a board. Silent Hall Creeper has some wonderful abilities, but can only use 2 of these abilities before he transforms into a copy of Shoreline Looter or something. Scion of Calamity is a fantastic card I wanted to include in the original list, but with its 5/5 Myriad Body and ability to blow up artifacts and enchantments a player controls, I can see why the card's $1.50. The main card I would be adding in, if I had the budget for it though, would be Glissa Sunslayer. Glissa's got First Strike and Death Touch, so people are not likely to block her to begin with, and whenever she deals combat damage to a player, we draw a card and lose 1 life, or blow up a target enchantment. These are amazing abilities. She can also get rid of 3 counters from a permanent, letting you get rid of an entire Planeswalker. A Quilled Great Worm from Foundations would also be fantastic, as whenever a creature you control deals combat damage during your turn, you put that many 1/1 counters on that creature. It's basically another copy of Necropolis Regent for our deck, with the added benefit of being able to summon itself from the graveyard. A Heroic Intervention can be used to prevent your opponents from interacting with your board state if you get a few important creatures out. And finally, Phage the Untouchable, because making your opponent lose the game twice is a fucking power move. Anyways, that's all I could think about for this particular deck, and I'm going to be assembling this thing in paper really, really soon, because the idea just speaks to me on a very, very fundamental level. It scratches that part of my brain that wants old school, mid-rangey, fighty, anime Yu-Gi-Oh stuff, and it does it in such a efficient package that even at $15, nothing about the deck felt like it was having to make any real compromises. But maybe you have some other ideas for a deck like this that you would like to operate with. Let me know what those are in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already. Support me on Patreon if you really, really, really like what I do. And hey, that all said, thank you for being here. I appreciate every one of you. And insert end of video tagline here. Hey, just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who help keep me afloat and help keep this channel going. YouTube and Twitch are wonderful platforms, but at the end of the day, stability is not one of their strong suits. If you want to support my channel, then obviously Patreon is one of the best ways of doing that. Link is in the description. But I do want to personally thank everybody who has contributed to the channel. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravalern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Autumn and Angel, Nixie Chan, Agamotto, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fireshard. And everyone else who supports my channel and lets me do what I do full time. This is a dream job of mine that I never believed that I would be able to take full time, and with your help, I've been able to do it. So thank you so very much for that. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you all enjoy, and I hope you all are having a wonderful time. I will see you all in the next one, hopefully.